This was last fall. Do y'all remember what was happening last fall? And the wife of the couple had said, I just don't feel comfortable with this. We need to take our money out. We need to cash out. We need to move to cash. And they had. And so the article was going through really how did they make that decision to get out of the equity markets. Never in the article did anybody bring up that when you're saving for a home, really equity investments or stock investments are inappropriate vehicles for that savings. Really, saving for a home is a very short-term objective. And so our intent is to save for a home. We probably need to have it in something like a money market or a certificate of deposit or some kind of short-term instrument. But it was interesting to me, nowhere was that discussed. So intent and how we actually invest is directly related, but also intent is related to everything else that we do with our money. What are we intending? Anybody else have a thought about intent? So we start with intent because that's really going to give us the direction in which we're going to go, and that unfolds our plans around that. You know, from a garden perspective, I look at that and I say, are we going to have a woodlands or are we going to have a flower garden? We might want to have some of both. You know, we want to have some beauty, but we might want to have some woods. We might want to have some vegetables. So all those things are true in our financial life as well. There's a variety of things that we need to look at to put together the results that we want in our life. So the 7 lessons from the garden that we're going to look at today, the first one is the interconnectedness of choice. How do we make financial choices? And how do we make them one at a time? Or do we make them in perspective of everything else that we're doing? How does that work? And how do we know how to make those choices effective? Then we're going to look at the growth cycle. Someone mentioned earlier, I think it may have been Gigi, that there is a cycle. So what is a growth cycle and how does that impact our thinking about investing wealth and in wealth? And we're going to look at the patient payoff because part of the garden, as you mentioned before, is waiting. We take some actions and we have to have some patience. Then we're going to look at risk. The one thing that we never want to address and we don't really want to deal with when we're talking about money and wealth and prosperity, especially in investing, is we all want the risk-free investment that's going to return a lot of money, and it's always just going to go up in value. Of course, 10 or 12% a year, Mackey, would be fine. Then we're going to look at the fact that all things are not equal, and how does that really work for us? What does that mean, and how do we work with that to help us make more money? Then we're going to look at this unfortunate thing that just because we know the past doesn't mean we know the future. But how can the past assist us in understanding and planning for the future? And then we're going to look at something I call rules that rule. There are certain things that we just should never forget, that we just have to take into consideration when planning our garden, and we have to take into consideration when planning our wealth. So the first one is the interconnectedness of choice. And if I look at this slide is just all the different kind of pieces for me of a garden. And there could be lots more. I could fill up even more pictures on here for different parts of the garden. But if I am creating a garden, I have a lot of choices to make, right? As somebody mentioned, I have to prepare the soil that's in the foundation. If I'm thinking about a garden, I don't know about you, but I tend to think about what I'm going to get out of the garden. That's what excites me. Is that what excites you about your garden? The flowers or the vegetables or the food you're going to harvest? I don't get as excited about the soil. But what's so important about the soil? Yeah, it's everything. The better the soil, the more fruitful the garden. So really, a lot of times it's the same in money and finance. We have to spend time on the parts that aren't as beautiful or sexy or interesting. We have to build that foundation. We have to do that planning. We have to really make sure we have a solid foundation. And that's not quite as much fun, but it's the primer to get us to where we want to be. It's a primer to get to the harvest. We have to have some things, this up in the top. Does anybody know what these little things up in the top are with those little spots? Those are microbes. They're up next to the bees, so you wouldn't think it was a problem. But in our soil, we have to have microbes. We don't think about, I'm going to go put some microbes out of my soil, do we? No. But, we have to, those are part of what makes our soil rich. So there's some things that we need in our garden. Bugs, for example, or bees, that we don't really think about. I'm going to go out and get some bugs, bees, or microbes today, but we need them. In the financial area, I think of that as insurance. I don't wake up one morning and go, I just can't wait to buy my insurance today. But we need it, right? If we don't have insurance, then we wreck our car and we're in a mess. So there are some things that we need in our financial life There's some things that we need in our garden that are fundamental that we have to take care of. And we can have a variety of things. We have to have some sun, rain, and water. We have to have some things. But it's somewhat unpredictable, isn't it? The sun isn't so unpredictable. It's going to come up every day. But how sunny it's going to be is somewhat unpredictable. And how much rain we're going to get is somewhat unpredictable. And we have to have some plans for what if it doesn't rain enough. So if we look at all these in terms of how do we choose, if we choose just to plant fruit trees, for example, then we might have a lot of fruit, but we might get kind of tired of that after a while. So we have to think about all the different things in our garden. And if we only have so much space, if we only have an acre, for example, we have to think about how we're going to use those different parts. We can't use it all for one thing or won't have anything else. So how we do one thing impacts the other. So if we choose to ignore our soil, that impacts our harvest. If we choose to plant just vegetables, then we won't have anything else. If we want some meat, we have to think about having some chickens or beef or cattle or pigs or however we're going to do that. So one choice impacts the other. And we have to really think about what's the big picture and then make the choices within that same big picture. And that's really the paradigm that I want you to think about. We tend to go through our financial life and we think, okay, now I'm going to think about insurance. And we don't really think about that as it affects the rest of our life. Or now I'm going to think about my budget. Or we think, now I'm going to think about investing. We don't think about these decisions often as it relates to our whole life. And generally, the way that we make much more effective decisions is we have to start from the big picture and make the decisions within that picture. Otherwise, what I find is you can work a lot harder and still get to the same result. But if you want to work smarter, you have to have that big picture. The same is true for the garden. We have to have the big picture in mind, and then we make decisions within that big picture. Then we're very likely to get where we want to be, as opposed to making them as single individual choices. And then we've maybe planted our perennial garden, we haven't left any space for anything else. So choice is always there, and we need to look at those choices as how are we making the choices within the big frame. Okay. Lesson 2 is the growth cycle. If I took the cycle of the garden, I would start here with up at the top with planning. I plan my garden, prepare my soil, plant, tend, grow. Then I wait. I just have just have to wait. Tend. I have to tend my garden. I often have people say to me about wealth. Well, I've done what I need to do now. I don't need to do anything else, right? Well, I think you have to do the same amount of work for it every day, but you do have to tend your wealth, just like you have to tend your garden. Then we have some anticipation. Because now, have you ever plant your garden, you've got everything going, and you just wish it would come up, and it's not there, and you've got this little bitty plant, and you're still thinking about the tomato, and it's not here yet. There's an enjoyment of anticipation. And, of course, then the harvest. And harvests come a couple of different ways. The first one I think of is the little harvest. How many of you have planted a tomato before? Okay. How did the harvest come in? Yeah, right at first, or did it come in? Remember that first tomato? You were watching and watching and watching and watching, and finally, the first tomato. And you take it inside, and you're so excited to eat that first tomato. And then what happens? Then, lots of tomatoes. And you're thinking, what am I going to do with all these tomatoes? Okay, so that's true in our investment life. We're going to look at how does the big harvest, little harvest work in our investment life, because that's what's happening in economics as well. Of course, then we consume it, we store it. Somebody mentioned we pick some flowers, we leave some for later. We have that opportunity. If we're smart, we'll save some seeds to plant next year, and then we'll reassess our plan. So did I get what I wanted? Do I need to reassess that? And this same cycle, the same growth cycle, is the cycle that we would use if we were effectively planning our life. The step that we often omit, and the step that's very critical, is that very first step is planning. Because so often we get into the planting,